intelligent and committed witness to what's been happening. I remember I wasn't there, but I remember seeing the protests in Toronto, and they were very inspiring, so well done to all those involved in doing that. I think our next speaker, I've known him for maybe 10 years. He's been working very diligently in a support team in Bremen, the International Human Rights Association. He's he's been allowed to visit the country more than once, Nicolai, Jung, and he's also going to address the issue of genocide. And he, in particular, is going to look at the issue of genocide in respect of the yearnings and strivings of the Tamil people for nationhood.
Thank you very much. So, well, as Andy said, I've been asked to speak on the subject of genocide. But when I thought about the setup the audience would likely to be, I thought, why is it so important to talk about it at this time, at this place? Yeah? It's definitely not because of some kind of scientific interest or because we should follow some kind of legalistic approach towards a very deep-rooted and indeed long-lasting process in Sri Lanka. And in my view, it's also today not just because of the urge to bring out the very concrete experience of the Tamils, because in this place everybody knows about it. Nobody in the audience would dispute the fact, in my view, that a genocide is taking place in Sri Lanka and it's ongoing. Every Tamil family has to mourn members that have fallen victim to a genocidal process that dates back as far as to the colonial period under the British, as Mr. Fernando has already pointed out. So in my view, it is important to talk about the Tamil genocide today because the genocide is inseparably connected to the aspirations of the Tamil people that determine their struggle. Both things cannot be separated from each other. Because we have to ask ourselves, why does this genocidal process continue to go completely unabated since today, since it started? It was not because the world hates the Tamils or the world would want to exclude the Tamils from mankind. Yeah? It is because the aspirations of the Tamils clash with the interests of the most powerful nations of the world. The sad fact that has to be acknowledged is, as long as the Tamils strive for real freedom, they cannot expect any restraint, at least from these kind of nations. And this is a fundamental decision the Tamils have to make. When we talk about genocide, we have to ask, is there anybody around today who in the long history of oppression of the Tamils actually stopped this genocidal process at one point? The answer is no. Today there's nobody around. But there was a force who at one time in history stopped the genocide. It was the Tamils themselves who had to do it, actually. It was the LTTE who did it. In fact, the LTTE is the only force who ever achieved to open up the possibility to stop the genocide, even once and for all, and to bring a lasting peace to the island. In my view, there's no doubt about that. So, how did they manage to achieve this? How did they manage to stop the genocide, at least for one certain period? So, was it by defeating the Sinhalese army? I don't think so, because they did it before. Yeah. After trying several times to use their military achievements to engage in peace talks, it was only at the end of the 90s that actually both the international and the local conditions were conducive for a peace initiative. And this was the outcome of a twofold struggle that the Tamils had to fight against internal and, more important, against external factors. Having achieved military parity with the Sri Lankan state by establishing itself as a conventional force with the capability to fend off attacks on the territory under its control, the LTTE not only forced the Sri Lankan regime into a ceasefire, but also it defeated those international forces that were backing a military solution to the conflict. As a symbol for this achievement stands the capture of the Elephant Pass garrison in April 2000 by the LTTE, leading up to the peace talks. The defeat of the US-trained elite 53rd Division and the capture of the strategic important Elephant Pass, whose deep defenses were deemed impregnable by US and British defense advisors to the Sri Lankan regime, meant that the US position of a military solution finally got weakened among the ruling circles in Sri Lanka. The defeat of the military solution by the LTTE allowed the model of so-called liberal peace, which was promoted by Europe to gain the upper hand in their competition with the US for influence on the Sri Lankan politics. The concept of liberal peace was promoted by the EU, by the European industrial powers, which were of the view that peace itself, meaning the absence of war, to be concrete, was a good thing, as it enables the market environment conducive for the production-based economies. Of course, it was no altruism involved here, but nevertheless, it was a progressive step. So in this sense, global security for them means first and foremost a peaceful environment for the economic activities. This position, in my view, is diametrically opposed to the approach of the US that depends on the control of raw materials and strategic locations as a military-based strategy to compete with economically more successful powers. This contrast of economic strategies by the US and Britain on the one side and the German-led European industrial nations on the other is also reflected in their different approach towards conflict resolution itself. The acceptance of the three premises, no military solution to the Tamil question, a constitutional settlement and parity of status between the negotiating parties as a basis for their involvement showed that the co-chairs for the peace process accepted the European line over the militaristic approach of the US and Britain. And it was only under these conditions that a peaceful solution based on a negotiated settlement could become reality. The decision of the LTT to offer peace talks to the Sinhalese was based on the confidence that Europe would grab the chance provided by them to them after being freed, at least temporarily, by the LTTE from the dominance of the US, and that it would stick to its progressive role it was playing in that part of the world at least. Yeah? So, unfortunately, this wasn't to be the case. But it was not the Sinhalese who changed the EU's mind. I will give one example about the EU ban. When 7 major countries of the EU opposed the banning of the LTTE, the Sri Lankan foreign minister at that time, Mangala Samaravira, had to travel to Washington to meet Condoleezza Rice, who then promised to make the EU change its mind. So, while proclaiming their support for the peace process, the US deliberately took steps to alter the military balance in favor of the Sri Lankan state. Britain and the US ensured that the Sri Lankan military forces were trained and armed to a much higher level than ever, while at the same time taking international measures to undermine the military strength and the political legitimacy of the LTTE. They knew fully well that it was the military parity between the Sri Lankan armed forces and the LTTE that had laid the basis for the peace talks to begin, and that it was also the key to its maintenance. So, in their view, it was, of course, not the LTTE itself that was the problem. They were representing the aspirations of the Tamil people, and the aspirations were the problem and are still the problem. So even today, nobody should expect that now that the LTTE is gone, that the overall policies of the great powers would change. The reasons that were fundamental to support the restart of the war are still there. So, why is it important in this context today? If you look today, who could be your possible friends, it is imperative, in my view, to take the lessons from history into account. If you look for support inside the international establishments, if you want to do that, you have to look for those who oppose the return of war. In fact, if you talk about genocide limiting the allegations solely against the Rajapaksa regime without mentioning the international context, then there's a danger that the Tamils, that the atrocities that they had to endure will be used by those forces that are complicit in the genocide in the first place. So, apart from urging the Tamils not to fall prey to false promises, I urge those individuals and representatives of those nations and institutions and organizations who supported the strive for peace and justice of the Tamils and raised their voice against the return of war at that time to come forward today and join hands to work for real freedom of the Tamils. Thank you very much.